Hey guys, tonight we walk into a dim museum room where the lights are low and the air feels cool enough to slow your thoughts down. You are standing in front of a case of cracked clay tablets, each one the size of a hand, each one carrying wedge marks like tiny bird tracks frozen mid-sprint. Somewhere beyond the glass, an ancient scribe is still pressing a reed into soft mud, and the sound is almost audible if you let the rest of your day drift off your shoulders. This is the kind of night where some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some are calm, what-if imagination. The story might link, it might rhyme, it might just share the same human worries wearing different outfits. Historians debate, archaeologists argue gently, and the evidence suggests patterns without forcing certainty. Also, fair warning, you probably will not survive this emotionally if you're the type who wants every myth to have a neat, labeled drawer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you are listening from and what your local time is. Because I love the idea of this story drifting across time zones like slow smoke. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the clay, and the first thing that hits you is how ordinary it looks. Not magical, not glowing, just mud that got organized. Most historians agree that writing in Mesopotamia develops very early, and the evidence we do have points to practical beginnings. Counting grain, tracking sheep, listing workers, recording rations. Before anyone writes about gods splitting seas or gardens with forbidden fruit, someone is doing accounting, which is both hilarious and deeply human. The oldest written stories are born in the same neighborhood as the oldest receipts. If ancient civilization had a motto, it might be first inventory, then poetry. You imagine a scribe in a warm courtyard. He sits cross-legged near a basket of damp clay. He picks up a stylus, a cut reed or a shaped bit of wood, and he presses, not drawing lines, but making dents, neat wedges, tiny angles. That method matters because it shapes the look of the script. Cuneiform is not a flowing ink alphabet, it is a system of impressions. And because clay tablets can be dried, baked, stored, and reused, they become both durable and accidental survivors. Paper rots, papyrus frays, clay, when it is fired by time or by a disaster, can last, which means a city burning down, in the most tragic way, might also preserve its library. History has a strange habit of saving things through catastrophe, then making you squint at the result centuries later. As you stand there, you let the museum hush settle into your chest. You're not just looking at an artifact, you're looking at a technology, and technology changes culture. Once you can write, you can stabilize a story. You can repeat it. You can argue over exact wording. You can hand it to someone who was not in the room. That might sound obvious, but it is a huge shift. Oral storytelling can be vivid and flexible, shaped by the audience and the mood of the night. Writing can be vivid too, but it locks something down. It turns sound into object. It makes memory portable. Now you drift from the museum case to a mental map of Mesopotamia. Rivers, fields, city walls, temples, ziggurats rising like layered mountains made of brick. What's broadly accepted is that city life here is intense and early, and it creates a hunger for records, lists, and legitimacy. Kings want their reigns remembered. Priests want rituals performed correctly. Merchants want debts tracked. And people, being people, want to explain why the world feels dangerous and beautiful at the same time. That is where myth comes in. not as a childish lie, but as an attempt to carry meaning. You run your attention over a key idea. Not every tablet is a story tablet. Many are administrative. A lot of what survives is boring in the best way. But among the practical texts, there are also hymns, prayers, epics, debates, and myths. Some are copied and recopied in scribal schools. Students practice by writing classics, the way you might practice handwriting by copying a famous poem. That matters because when a text becomes a school text, it spreads. It gets standardized. It gets a kind of cultural gravity. Now, you shift to Genesis, not the band, though, yes, you can already hear the jokes forming in your head. No, Genesis as the opening of the Hebrew Bible. A text that most historians agree reaches its final literary form later than the earliest Sumerian compositions. The story of Genesis exists in a world where writing is already an old tool. It is not the dawn of scribes, it is the craft of scribes after centuries of practice. And that difference in timing is one reason people ask your exact question. Are these stories linked? Or are we seeing coincidence? You take a slow breath and place 3 ideas on the table. Like 3 small stones you can turn in your fingers. First stone. Shared geography. The ancient Near East is not a set of sealed jars. It is a connected region of trade, war, intermarriage, diplomacy, exile, and travel. Ideas move along with goods. A merchant carries gossip as easily as copper. A captive carries songs. A diplomat carries metaphors. Even if people do not call it borrowing, stories can travel. Second stone. Shared human concerns. Floods happen, drought happens, babies die, kings boast, people fear the dark. People look at the sky and wonder who is driving it. If 2 cultures face similar realities, their stories might develop similar shapes. This is where coincidence has real power. Not every parallel is a pipeline. Sometimes it is just the human brain doing what it does. Third stone, literary conversation. One interpretation is that later writers sometimes respond to older traditions, either by adopting familiar motifs or by pushing back against them. That does not require copying word for word. It can be a subtle dialogue. A story can take a known pattern and twist it to make a point. This is suggestive, not conclusive. But it is one way scholars talk about relationships between texts. You pace through the museum room in your mind, and you notice a detail people often miss. When we say Sumerian tablets, we are actually talking about a range of languages and periods. Sumerian is an early language in southern Mesopotamia. But later, Mesopotamian culture includes Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian. Texts get translated, adapted, reworked. So the question is not simply Sumerian versus Genesis. It is a whole river system of storytelling feeding into a later landscape. And then there is the practical problem. How do we even know what a tablet says? You picture a modern scholar under a lamp, turning a tablet slowly, finding the angle where wedge marks cast little shadows. Some signs are chipped, some lines are missing, some are copied with mistakes by ancient students who, just like you in school, are absolutely capable of messing up and hoping nobody notices. You almost want to pat them on the shoulder across 3,000 years and whisper, "You and me both." Translation adds another layer. A sign might have multiple values, a word might shift over centuries, a line might be restored from parallels in other copies. This is why careful scholars speak in probabilities. They say the text likely means this. It might suggest that, and when a claim is flashy, a cautious reader checks how firm the reading is. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now you take your attention to the act of comparison itself. People love to place Genesis beside Mesopotamian myths like puzzle pieces. But a real comparison has to be picky. You cannot just say, both have a flood, therefore same story. You have to ask, what is the role of the flood? What moral or theological point is it making? Who causes it and why? How does the hero respond? What does survival mean afterward? Similar motifs can serve different messages. This is where the calm, sleepy mystery creeps in. Because once you allow for both contact and coincidence, the space between them becomes a kind of foggy hallway. And in that hallway, people tell all sorts of stories. Some are responsible and careful. Some are a little too confident. A fringe idea proposes that there was a single master narrative from a lost civilization, and every ancient culture is just quoting it in fragments. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows up because humans crave a central origin, a secret blueprint. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less of a claim and more of a mood. What if there was a forgotten library behind all libraries? A more cautious explanation could be simpler and, honestly, more interesting. Scribal culture creates shared habits. Stories are shaped by what scribes learn to write and copy. If you train scribes on certain texts, those texts become the baseline for imagination. Later writers, even in different communities, may absorb motifs through the general cultural air, not because of conspiracy, but because of proximity. That kind of influence is hard to prove like a math problem, but it is plausible in a connected region. You pause and let your mind settle on the museum glass again. Behind it, the clay looks dry, but you can almost feel it when it was new. Cool and damp, easy to mark. You picture a tablet being written, then left to dry in the sun. The scribe smooths the surface, presses wedges, flips it, adds a colophon, maybe a note about where it belongs. He does not know he is becoming a bridge for someone with headphones in the year 2026 trying to fall asleep while thinking about Genesis. If he did know, he might add a line like, "Dear future person, please stop using me to start arguments in the comments." Which, yes, is exactly what would happen. Now you consider dating. The evidence we do have points to early written materials in Mesopotamia, long before the Hebrew Bible takes its final shape. But Genesis itself is a layered work, and scholars continue to debate how and when various traditions within it were composed and edited. That is not a problem. It is just reality for ancient literature. Texts can grow like cities. Older neighborhoods remain. Newer walls are built, and the map you see at the end includes multiple eras at once. The comparison question becomes, when a Genesis story resembles a Mesopotamian story, is that resemblance because of direct borrowing, shared environment, or universal pattern? Often, it is some mix. But here comes the required humility line, the one that keeps you from turning mist into marble. Historians still argue whether the strongest parallels reflect direct literary dependence or broader cultural diffusion through centuries of shared Near Eastern life. You let that sentence sink in like a slow pebble into water. Not because it is frustrating, but because it is honest. And honesty is sleepy. Certainty is loud. Honest uncertainty is quiet enough to rest with. So you stand there, in your mind, balancing clay and parchment, temple schools and later scribal circles. You notice that even the way people imagine divine speech can differ. Some Mesopotamian texts present a world full of competing gods and shifting politics in the heavens, while Genesis often speaks with a more unified, divine voice. That difference can be read as a theological statement. One interpretation is that biblical writers sometimes reshape familiar motifs to emphasize a different understanding of divine order. Again, that is interpretation, not a stamped verdict. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the link is not about copying, but about questions? Why is there suffering? Why do humans struggle with pride? Why do cities rise and fall? Why does water both sustain and destroy? When you look at it that way, the tablets and Genesis are less like rival origin stories and more like two lamps in the same dark room. They illuminate different corners, they cast different shadows, and you, standing between them, are not required to pick a team. You are allowed to be curious. You are allowed to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that Mesopotamia produces very early written myths and records, and later Israelite traditions develop in a region that is culturally intertwined with Mesopotamia in complex ways. The mist is exactly how each motif moves, transforms, and lands. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You take one last look at the wedge marks. They are small, but they hold worlds. And as you let your breathing slow, you realize the first step tonight is not deciding who copied whom. The first step is learning to recognize how stories behave when they travel. They pick up dust, they lose pieces, they gain new meanings, and they keep walking anyway. Like you, moving quietly through the dark. You are standing on a riverbank at night, and the water looks like dark glass that never stays still. The air smells faintly of mud and reeds, the kind of smell that feels older than language. A breeze slides across your skin, and you can hear insects working their tiny night shift, absolutely committed to the job. You crouch and drag your fingers through the damp silt, and it feels easy to believe that stories could start here, where the land is generous and dangerous in the same breath. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia is shaped by rivers, especially the Tigris and Euphrates, and that these rivers can be both life and threat. Archaeology suggests that flooding is a recurring feature of the region, sometimes seasonal, sometimes severe, sometimes made worse by human choices like irrigation and canal management. Even without a single worldwide catastrophe, it makes sense that flood memories would lodge deep in the imagination. When your entire civilization depends on water behaving, you learn to respect it, fear it, praise it, and complain about it. Mostly complain. Humans have always been consistent that way. You walk along the bank as if you are following a line of thought. The ground is soft. Your footsteps leave prints that fill slowly with seeped water, as if the river is already taking notes. You look up, and the stars seem sharper than you are used to, because modern light pollution is not invited to the scene. The sky is enormous. The river is patient. And somewhere in the distance, you imagine a city of brick and torchlight, a place where scribes try to trap the shape of memory in clay. Now you let the flood story rise, not as a punchline, not as an argument, but as a slow, moving piece of human atmosphere. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature includes a famous flood tradition, preserved in different forms over time. One early Sumerian version speaks of a righteous figure often called Ziusudra, and later Akkadian traditions include a flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Atrahasis story. These texts are not identical to each other, which is important. They already show variation inside Mesopotamia itself. That detail alone tells you something about how stories behave. They adapt. They get retold. They pick up new details like a traveler picking up dust on sandals. In these Mesopotamian versions, the gods decide to send a flood, and a favored human is warned. He is instructed to build a large boat. He gathers animals, family, and goods, and he survives. After the waters recede, he offers a sacrifice, and the divine world responds. Many listeners hear that outline and immediately think of Noah. And yes, the parallels are real enough to notice. But noticing is not the same as concluding. You keep walking and let yourself zoom in on specifics, because details are where real comparison lives. In some Mesopotamian accounts, the divine decision is tied to noise, overcrowding, or the irritation of gods who cannot sleep. That motive feels almost comically relatable. Imagine cosmic beings filing a complaint like a neighbor banging on the wall at 2 a.m. Please keep humanity down to a reasonable volume. Meanwhile, in Genesis, the rationale is framed differently, with moral and ethical emphasis. The flood is tied to human wrongdoing and corruption. Depending on interpretation, even when the story shape is similar, the moral engine can be different. One interpretation is that shared story bones can be reused to make a new point. Another interpretation is that both traditions draw from older, widely circulating flood memories without direct copying. A more cautious explanation could be that flood stories are the ancient Near East's way of processing the terrifying reality that water, the source of life, can also erase everything. You stop at a bend in the river, and you imagine how floods would feel in a low-lying plain. Not the gentle overflow you want for crops, but a wall of water, the kind that arrives with wind and debris and panic. Houses built of mud brick can weaken. Storage jars can topple. Livestock can drown. And afterward, the landscape changes. Channels shift. Fields get covered in sediment. That experience would be unforgettable. The way certain smells or sounds stick to your memory forever. You look at the water again and think about the word flood itself. It is one word that hides many events. A regional flood is not a global flood. A river flood is not a coastal storm surge. A series of floods over generations can merge into one legendary flood in collective memory. Archaeology can sometimes identify flood layers in certain sites, but it cannot easily match a specific layer to a specific story. And even when a flood layer exists, it does not automatically mean it is the flood of a particular myth. The evidence we do have points to real flooding, but the jump from sediment to scripture is never automatic. Historians still argue whether the shared elements between Mesopotamian flood traditions and Genesis reflect direct literary influence, indirect cultural diffusion, or a broader human tendency to mythologize catastrophic water events. That line lands softly, not to ruin the vibe, but to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Because this topic is a magnet for certainty, and certainty tends to stomp around like it owns the room. Tonight, you want to quiet footsteps. You continue along the river, and you imagine a scribal school. A young student presses cuneiform signs into clay, trying to keep the line straight. His teacher leans over and sighs in that timeless way teachers sigh, as if they have been sighing since the invention of the sigh. The student is copying a flood narrative because it is famous, because it teaches vocabulary, because it teaches moral ideas, because it is thrilling in a world without streaming services. The flood story is a blockbuster you can hold in your hand. Now you shift to Genesis as literature. Most historians agree that the text comes through a long process of composition and editing, shaped by religious and historical experiences. One widely discussed context is that Israelite and Judean communities lived among powerful empires, and their literature reflects engagement with the ideas of the region. That engagement can include adoption, adaptation, and critique. If you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, Genesis might be seen as telling a flood story that feels familiar in outline while sounding distinct in theology and tone. To keep things calm, you imagine the story not as a courtroom case but as a marketplace. In a marketplace, ideas are exchanged, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. A merchant hears a tale in one city, repeats it in another with different jokes and different emphasis. A traveler shortens it, a priest moralizes it, a parent turns it into a bedtime warning. Be kind, or the water will get you. Humans are excellent at transforming narratives, and they do it with the same confidence they use to give cooking advice after making pasta. Once, you smile a little at that, because yes, ancient storytellers and modern comment sections share a surprising amount of energy. Now you examine another layer of the flood tradition, the boat. In Mesopotamian versions, the vessel can be described with striking measurements and construction details. Some traditions describe a large, sealed craft, carefully built, sometimes with multiple decks. In Genesis, the ark is also described with dimensions and materials, emphasizing order and preparation. What does that tell you? It tells you that both traditions are interested in making the story feel concrete. A boat that is purely symbolic is less satisfying than a boat you can picture. This is storytelling craft, the ancient equivalent of adding realistic sound effects. You can almost hear the hammering and the creak of wood. And if you listen carefully, you can also hear someone asking, politely, how many animals counts as two of each? Because the logistics are, frankly, exhausting. You do not get to build a giant animal boat without someone inventing a spreadsheet in their heart. Now you think about animals. Both traditions include the gathering of animals, and this motif can be read in multiple ways. It can be seen as practical survival, but it can also function as a statement about restoring order after chaos. Animals represent the world's diversity. Preserving them implies that the point is not total destruction, but renewal. One interpretation is that the flood story is a reset narrative, an attempt to answer the question, how does life start again after everything breaks? You tilt your head and listen to the river, and you let a more mysterious thought wander in, carefully labeled as mist. A popular rumor claims that flood stories encode memory of an ancient, lost civilization, a world before the water that was more advanced than we assume. This idea is not widely accepted, and hard evidence for it is thin. But the rumor persists because it has the emotional shape people like, a golden age, a catastrophe, survivors carrying secrets. If you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic thought experiment. What if the flood is not only about punishment or nature, but also about forgetting? What if the real disaster is not death, but the loss of knowledge? Then you bring yourself back to the solid ground. We do know that ancient societies can lose knowledge after disruptions. Cities fall, trade routes collapse, specialists die, libraries burn, skills narrow. That does not require Atlantis. It only requires human fragility. A more cautious explanation could be that the flood story reflects a real fear, not just drowning, but being cut off from continuity. Now you wade a little closer to the water, just enough to feel the coolness creep into your ankles. You notice debris caught in reeds, and it gives you a small, practical understanding of what floodwaters carry. They carry pieces of homes. They carry seeds. They carry bodies of animals. They carry memories turned into objects. And afterward, when the water retreats, people rebuild. They tell stories. They assign meaning. They ask why. This is where the sacrifice motif matters. In Mesopotamian accounts, the survivor offers sacrifice, and the gods respond, sometimes with hunger imagery, sometimes with regret. In Genesis, sacrifice also appears, and it carries theological meaning in a different register. Without making any absolute claims, you can say that both traditions understand ritual as a bridge between human vulnerability and the divine realm. People want reassurance that the chaos will not repeat, or at least not in the same way. People want a promise, even if it is a cautious promise. You imagine the smell of smoke rising into night air, and you understand why such a detail stays in a story. Smoke is visible. It travels upward. It is a physical sign of an invisible appeal. And it is also the oldest form of sending a message without needing a phone plan, which is honestly impressive. Now you consider another set of differences that often gets overlooked. The tone of the divine. In some Mesopotamian texts, the gods can appear divided, with one deity warning the human while others push for destruction, creating a kind of heavenly politics. In Genesis, the divine voice tends to be more singular, with a different kind of authority and moral focus. One interpretation is that the biblical version reorients a familiar narrative framework toward a distinct religious worldview. Again, that is interpretation, but it is a reasonable one that many discussions circle around. You keep your pace slow, like you're strolling through a dream that does not need to arrive anywhere. Now you ask the question that actually matters for your original topic: linked or coincidence? If you want to be careful, you hold both possibilities at once. It is possible that scribal communities in the ancient Near East knew flood traditions that circulated widely, and that the biblical writers were aware of story patterns that had been told for centuries in surrounding cultures. It is also possible that some parallels arise because flood is an obvious motif in a river-based world, and because human storytelling tends to build similar structures around catastrophe and survival. And then there is a third possibility that feels the most realistic: a blended scenario. A story can be both inherited and reinvented. It can arrive as a familiar melody and become a new song with different lyrics. As you stand in the river breeze, you let the water keep moving without needing to solve it. Tonight is not about proving anything. Tonight is about following clues and enjoying the way the clues glimmer without becoming a command. You take one last look at the river and imagine a boat, not as a cartoon, but as a symbol of preparation. Humans cannot stop every flood, but humans can build arcs of many kinds: granaries, laws, communities, stories. Stories are also arcs. They carry meaning through disaster. They keep a sense of order afloat when the world feels like it is tilting. And in that quiet thought, you let the river sound soften your mind, like a fan humming in the dark, steady and unbothered, as if the water has heard every theory and still prefers to keep flowing. You step into a garden that does not belong to any one map. The air is warm, but not heavy, scented with crushed leaves and something sweet you cannot name. Under your feet, the soil feels soft, tended, as if someone has been kneeling here for hours, coaxing life into neat rows. A distant fountain murmurs like a quiet friend who never interrupts. Above you, branches interlace into a ceiling of green, and the moonlight slips through in thin ribbons that land on your hands like gentle silver. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian cultures loved the idea of sacred gardens, cultivated spaces where order pushes back against wilderness. Temples had offerings of fruit and plants. Kings boasted about orchards and irrigation, and the imagery of a well-watered paradise appears in more than one tradition across the region. Archaeology suggests that controlling water and cultivating land was not just practical, it was symbolic. A garden was proof that humans could partner with the forces of nature, rather than be swallowed by them. You walk slowly between trees and think about why gardens matter in stories. A garden is a boundary. Inside it, there is rule and rhythm. Outside it, there is uncertainty. That is already a myth in physical form. You can tell a child, stay inside the gate, and you are safe. You can tell an adult, keep your life ordered, and you are safe. And then reality laughs softly, because life is never perfectly ordered. That tension is exactly where stories like Eden begin to breathe. Most historians agree that Genesis includes a garden scene that is central to its early chapters. and it is filled with symbols that feel both simple and deep. Trees, a command, a choice, a serpent. The sudden awareness of nakedness and shame, even if you have heard it 100 times, it is a story with strong gravity. Now you let your mind hold a second garden image from Mesopotamia, one that comes from myth and epic rather than scripture. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is a scene involving a plant of life, a chance at renewal, and a serpent that steals it away. The details and meaning are not identical to Genesis, but the motif is striking enough to make people pause. A plant or tree connected to life, a serpent linked to loss, a human facing the limits of mortality. One interpretation is that these are shared symbols in a shared cultural world. Another interpretation is that later writers may have known some version of these motifs and reshaped them into a different kind of lesson. A more cautious explanation could be that serpents and plants naturally attract symbolic meaning in many cultures, because they are vivid in real life. A snake sheds its skin, so it looks like it is renewing itself. Plants die and return with seasons, so they look like resurrection. You do not need secret borrowing for humans to connect those dots. You only need eyes and fear and wonder. You stop near a tree with smooth bark and broad leaves, and you place your palm against it. The trunk is cool, and you imagine the way ancient people might have looked at trees as more than wood. Trees hold shade. They hold fruit. They mark water sources. They live longer than you. A tree can feel like a witness. In a world where many things are uncertain, trees become anchors. If someone tells you there is a tree connected to knowledge or life, your mind accepts it almost immediately. Of course there is. That is exactly the kind of thing a tree would do. Just standing there, looking wise, not paying rent, living for centuries like it owns the place. You smile. Because yes, even in a sacred garden, your modern sarcasm sneaks in. Now you consider Eden with fresh eyes. The garden is not just a backdrop. It is a stage for boundaries. There is a command, a limit, and a choice. The serpent appears as a voice that questions. It suggests another possibility. It reframes the command. In many interpretations, the story explores autonomy, desire, trust, and the human relationship with divine authority. And it does it with a few objects that any listener can picture. Fruit, leaves, a tree, a snake, a path out of the gate. When people compare Eden to Mesopotamian imagery, the question becomes, are we seeing a link, or are we seeing a universal toolkit of symbols? What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myth contains themes of humans seeking divine privileges, being limited by the gods, and living with mortality. In some stories, humans are created to serve the gods, to take on labor, to maintain temples, to keep the cosmic order running. In Genesis, there is also a sense of vocation and stewardship, but it is framed differently depending on how one reads the text. One interpretation is that Genesis participates in the same broad conversation about what humans are for. While offering a distinct answer, you walk deeper into the garden and notice a small channel of water. It runs in a controlled line, not wild, guiding moisture to roots. Water management is not just engineering here. It is story language. In Mesopotamia, canals were lifelines. The ability to direct water was almost divine power. In Genesis, rivers are named in the garden narrative, and the image of a watered paradise is present. A careful reading might suggest that water is a sign of blessing, order, and life. Then comes the serpent, and this is where the mystery loves to linger. In Mesopotamian culture, snakes show up in multiple roles. They can be dangerous, protective, associated with healing, or linked to the underworld. The symbol is not one note. It can mean renewal because of shedding skin, or it can mean threat because of venom, or it can mean cunning because of its movement and silence. If a serpent appears in one story as a thief of life and in another as a tempter, that overlap can be suggestive without being conclusive. You're not proving anything tonight. You're following clues. A fringe idea proposes that the serpent motif preserves memory of an ancient class of beings, not literal reptiles, but a coded reference to priesthoods, rival factions, or knowledge keepers. This idea is not widely accepted, and evidence for any specific code is thin. But it persists because it feels cinematic. What if the serpent is not an animal, but a symbol for human persuasion itself? The voice that can turn a boundary into a dare. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be useful. It invites you to read the serpent as a function rather than a creature. The function is temptation, reframing, clever speech. And clever speech is something humans have always had, often right when they should be asleep. You keep moving and notice the sound of leaves, a soft rustle. You think about the moment in Genesis when humans cover themselves with fig leaves. Suddenly self-aware. That is a psychological pivot. It is also a social pivot. Shame is not just private, it is relational. It changes how you see yourself and how you imagine being seen. The story captures a shift from innocence to self-consciousness with a simple costume change. No special effects needed, just leaves. Now you look for Mesopotamian parallels, not in identical plot points, but in emotional architecture. Mesopotamian epics often grapple with mortality, the limits of human striving, and the consequences of overreaching. Gilgamesh, for example, seeks immortality and fails, and he returns to his city with a different understanding of what lasts. That arc is not Eden, but it resonates with the human condition Eden describes. You want more. You reach, you learn you are limited, and you must live with that knowledge. Historians still argue whether the garden imagery and serpent motifs in Genesis reflect direct engagement with Mesopotamian mythic themes or a broader symbolic language common to the ancient Near East. You let that sentence settle like a leaf drifting onto water. Now you focus on the concept of knowledge. In Genesis, the tree is described as connected to knowledge of good and evil, a phrase that has sparked endless interpretation. Some read it as moral discernment. Some read it as the experience of moral complexity. Some read it as the ability to define morality independently. Whatever your preferred reading, the story treats knowledge as powerful and potentially dangerous. Knowledge changes you, and once you have it, you cannot unhave it. That is a very modern feeling for a very ancient story. You have scrolled one too many headlines, and you cannot go back to the simpler brain you had an hour ago. In Mesopotamian traditions, knowledge is also powerful. Scribes and priests held specialized wisdom. There were rituals, omens, and interpretations of the sky. There were lists and lexical texts, the ancient equivalent of reference manuals. Knowledge could be sacred. It could be guarded. It could be used. One interpretation is that ancient societies recognized that knowledge is never neutral. It can order life, but it can also destabilize it. Now you notice how Genesis frames the garden as a place with a command, and how the act of crossing that command results in exile. Exile is not just punishment. It is a narrative device that explains why life feels hard. Why do you toil? Why do you sweat? Why do relationships hurt? Why does childbirth involve pain? Why does the ground resist you? The story gives a mythic explanation for ordinary suffering, and it does so without gore, just with consequence. Mesopotamian literature also contains explanations for why humans labor, why the world is precarious, why gods can be distant or unpredictable. These are not identical explanations, but they are responses to similar questions. That overlap can make the link feel tempting. But remember the truth ladder. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. So here is the gentle imagination, clearly labeled. What if you are walking in a real orchard near an ancient canal, and a storyteller is speaking to a small group around a low fire? He is describing a garden where a choice changed the world. Across the river, in another settlement, someone is telling a story about a hero who found a plant of life and lost it to a serpent. They are not reading each other's scripts. They are not copying lines, but the air between their cities is shared. Traders move, songs move, symbols move, and the stories drift like pollen, landing in new soil, growing into new shapes. That is a mood, not a claim. Sabai, it is the cinematic. What if that helps you feel how ideas can travel without needing a single moment of official transfer? Now you return to a grounded point that keeps you safe and honest. Similar motifs do not automatically prove a direct link, but they can raise the possibility of cultural conversation, especially in regions where people interacted over long periods. A careful reading might suggest that Genesis participates in a wider, Near Eastern landscape of myth and meaning, even as it expresses its own distinct theological vision. You stand near the garden gate, which is half shadow, half moonlight. You can see the path beyond it. Rougher, less manicured. You can almost feel the shift from sheltered to exposed, and you realize the garden story is not just about a first couple. It is about you. About stepping out of simplicity into complexity, out of childhood into adulthood, out of not knowing into knowing. The leaves rustle again, and you let your eyes close for a moment. Whether linked or coincidental, these garden motifs keep returning because they touch something universal. You want life, you want wisdom, you want safety, you want more than you are allowed, and you live in the tension between desire and limit, listening for the soft voice that tells you the boundary is negotiable. Tonight, you do not need to decide if one garden borrowed from another. You only need to feel how both kinds of garden stories are trying to hold the same slippery thing. The moment the human heart realizes it is human and cannot go back, you walk into a city built from sun-baked brick, where the air holds heat even at night, like the streets are quietly hoarding it. Torches flicker in doorways. Oil lamps glow behind woven curtains. Somewhere nearby, a donkey complains as if it has a strong opinion about urban planning. The scent of smoke, beer, and river water mixes into something that feels both alive and slightly exhausting. This is the kind of place where people do not just live. They stack their lives upward, layer upon layer, until the skyline becomes a statement. Most historians agree that the great cities of Mesopotamia, especially places like Babylon, become powerful symbols in the ancient Near East. Archaeology suggests that these cities are not only political centers, but also cultural magnets, pulling in merchants, scribes, laborers, captives, and travelers. When a city grows large enough, it becomes more than a city. It becomes an idea that can inspire pride, fear, envy, and a lot of storytelling. You weave through a crowded street and notice how many languages you might be hearing. Some words are sharp and fast. Some are slow and thick with unfamiliar consonants. Some are sung like a chant, and some are shouted, because commerce apparently requires volume, no matter what century you are in. You watch a merchant gesture wildly at a stack of dyed cloth, while a buyer responds with the universal language of skepticism, raised eyebrows and a long pause. This is where the story of Babel begins to feel less like a fantasy and more like a mythic reflection of something real. What's broadly accepted is that ancient imperial cities often included diverse populations. Empires move people around. They relocate communities. They gather specialists. They concentrate power. A major city becomes a crossroads where languages collide, and where misunderstanding is not a rare accident but a daily feature. Now you let Genesis enter the street like a quiet narrator. In the Tower of Babel's story, humans gather with one language and one speech, and they decide to build a city and a tower that reaches the heavens. The story describes ambition, unity, and a desire to make a name. Then, the language is confused, the project fractures, and people scatter. The story is short, but it is dense, like a small tablet that carries more weight than its size suggests. One interpretation is that Babel is a moral story about pride and overreach, using a city and a tower as symbols. Another interpretation is that it explains, in mythic terms, why the world is full of different languages and why humans struggle to cooperate. And a more cautious explanation could be that it is a reflection on imperial power, on the way centralized projects can collapse when cohesion breaks. You look up, and the skyline rises toward a great stepped temple tower, a ziggurat layered like a wedding cake designed by someone who thinks subtlety is a weakness. Archaeology suggests that ziggurats are real structures, monumental religious buildings that serve as elevated platforms, connecting temple ritual with the sky. They are not literally attempts to storm heaven with ladders, but they do create a dramatic vertical axis between earth and the divine. The famous ziggurat associated with Babylon in later tradition is called Etemenanke in some sources, often described as a temple tower connected to the god Marduk. The specific details of its height and history are reconstructed from ancient records and later references, and not every detail is certain. Still, the basic idea is grounded. Babylon is a city that loves big building, and big building invites big storytelling. You keep walking until you reach a plaza where officials oversee labor. You see lines of workers carrying bricks. You see scribes counting deliveries. You see a foreman waving his arms like he is conducting an orchestra of exhausted humans. The practical machinery of a massive construction project is right there in front of you. Labor organization, resource management, administrative control. In other words, civilization doing what it does best, building something impressive while complaining about it. Now, you let the Babel story and Mesopotamian city life sit side by side without forcing them to fuse. A tower story could be inspired by the visual dominance of ziggurats. It could also be inspired by the experience of empire, where a central authority gathers people and imposes a shared project. Or it could be a symbolic critique of a worldview that trusts monuments more than humility. What's broadly accepted is that Babylon becomes an especially potent symbol for later Jewish communities, particularly in contexts of conflict and displacement. One interpretation is that Babel functions as a kind of literary shorthand for a proud empire, a place where human power feels overwhelming and where identity feels threatened. But even if you set historical specifics aside, the story works as a general warning. When humans build for the sake of ego, the foundation can crack. Then there is the language angle, and it gets interesting fast. From a modern linguistic standpoint, languages diversify over time through migration, separation, contact, and change. No single moment of magical confusion is needed to explain why French exists or why your phone autocorrect insists on humiliating you in public. Still, myths do not compete with science in the same arena. Myths tell emotional truth. They take a complex reality and give it a shape you can hold. In Babel, language is not just vocabulary, it is unity, it is shared purpose, it is a way of being one people. When language fractures, cooperation becomes harder. The story imagines language as the thread that holds a project together. Cut the thread, and the whole tapestry loosens. Archaeology suggests that multilingualism is common in ancient empires, and that scribes often work in multiple languages. Cuneiform itself is used for different languages over time, including Sumerian and Akkadian. That scribal reality is a quiet reminder that ancient people are not naive about language difference. They live with it, they manage it, they even build careers on it. So the Babel story is not a literal discovery that other languages exist. It is a mythic exploration of what language difference means. One interpretation is that Babel is less about linguistics and more about trust. If you cannot understand your neighbor, suspicion grows, confusion spreads, coordination fails, and suddenly the tower that seemed inevitable becomes impossible. You do not need divine thunderbolts to ruin a project. You only need a meeting where nobody agrees on what the meeting is about, which, yes, is a timeless human achievement. You pause near a wall and feel the brick texture under your fingertips. Each brick is uniform, standardized. That detail matters because Mesopotamian builders use mud brick extensively. And later, Babylonian tradition emphasizes kiln-fired bricks and bitumen for waterproofing and strength. Genesis even mentions bricks and bitumen in the Babel passage, which many readers notice as a specifically Mesopotamian flavor. The story does not mention stone. It mentions the materials of the region. That kind of detail can raise the possibility that the writer knows the building culture of Mesopotamia, at least in the broad sense. But knowledge does not automatically mean direct borrowing. It can be cultural awareness. It can be a shared world of references. It can be a storyteller choosing details that feel right. Now the mystery part slips in, soft and careful. A popular rumor claims that the tower is not merely symbolic, but a coded memory of ancient technology. Perhaps an attempt to reach the sky in a way that sounds strangely modern. This is not widely accepted, and there is no solid evidence for hidden machines humming in ziggurat basements. Still, the rumor persists because it satisfies a particular itch, the idea that ancient people knew more than we think, and that myths hide blueprints if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. The rumor becomes a bedtime thought experiment. What if the tower is a metaphor for any human project that reaches too far without understanding what it is touching? A more cautious explanation could be that the tower represents centralized power itself. You build upward. You concentrate authority. You pull resources from everywhere. You declare a single grand purpose. That can be impressive. It can also be brittle. The higher you build, the more you depend on coordination. And coordination depends on shared language, shared trust, shared restraint. You walk under an archway and catch snippets of speech you cannot decode. The words blur into sound. And then you remember a simple fact about misunderstanding. You do not need different languages to misunderstand someone. Two people speaking the same language can argue for hours, each thinking they are perfectly clear, while actually describing two different realities. So Babel can be read as a myth not only about languages, but about human limits in communication. Historians still argue whether the Babel story is primarily a reflection of Babylon as an imperial symbol, a theological critique of pride, an etiology explaining human linguistic diversity, or some blend of all three. You let that thought hover gently, like a lantern. Now you shift to another layer, the desire to make a name. In the Babel story, the builders say they want to make a name for themselves. That phrase is important in ancient cultures where name and legacy matter deeply. Kings carve their names into stone. They stamp their names on bricks. They commission inscriptions that declare their greatness. This is mainstream history. Rulers throughout the ancient Near East use building projects and inscriptions to project authority and to be remembered. So, a tower story that critiques the desire to make a name could be read as a critique of royal ideology, or at least of the human impulse behind it. One interpretation is that the story values humility and dispersion over centralized self-glorification. Another interpretation is that it warns against unity built on ego rather than on justice. You glance toward a palace wall where reliefs might show a king dominating enemies or presenting offerings to a god. In many Mesopotamian contexts, the king is a mediator, a builder, a maintainer of order. He builds temples, he repairs canals, he keeps the gods pleased and the people fed, at least in the official story. The reality, like all realities, is more complicated. Still, the building king is a common image. Genesis, in its own way, can be read as suspicious of certain kinds of centralized power, though interpretations vary. The Babel story does not say kings, but it describes collective ambition and monumental building. That feels close enough to the political atmosphere of empire to make readers wonder. Now you take a slow walk along the edge of the construction site and imagine the everyday worker. He is not building a tower to make a name. He's building because he was told to build. He wants rations. He wants his family safe. He wants his back to stop hurting. You realize something important. Big symbolic stories often ignore ordinary labor, even though ordinary labor is what actually makes monuments possible. Myths are rarely written from the viewpoint of the guy hauling bricks at noon. If they were, the tower story might include a line like, "Please tell the gods to confuse my supervisor's schedule first." You chuckle softly, because humor is a small ladder down from heavy ideas. Now, a careful reading might suggest that the scattering in Babel is not purely punishment. It also explains the spread of peoples across the earth, which in Genesis has a broader narrative function. The story makes sense of diversity and dispersion. It turns the messy reality of multiple nations into a coherent narrative moment. That is what origin stories do. They compress complexity into an image that sticks. You look up again. The tower is still rising in your imagination, but now it looks less like a cartoon and more like a symbol of a human pattern. You build, you coordinate, you dream, you push, then you hit a limit. The limit can be language, resources, politics, disease, drought, internal conflict. The myth dramatizes that limit as divine intervention, because divine intervention makes the limit feel meaningful rather than random. And here is a gentle what if, clearly labeled as imagination. What if, late at night, two scribes sit in a small room with a lamp and a pile of tablets. One of them has worked in an imperial administration and knows the sound of many tongues in a city square. The other has grown up hearing stories of a proud city that swallowed smaller ones. They speak quietly, not plotting, just reflecting. They shape a story where human pride runs upward like a tower, and the fracture of communication brings it down. They are not hiding a secret technology. They are giving a moral shape to an experience. Empire is loud, confusing, and unstable. That is a mood. Not a claim, but it helps you see how Babel might arise from real-life texture. You step away from the city center and into a quieter street. The noise dims, the stars return, the air cools. You realize that the Babel question is not only about whether Genesis is linked to Mesopotamian stories, it is also about what you do with a link if it exists. A link does not cancel meaning. It does not flatten everything into one bland soup. A link can be a conversation across centuries, where one tradition echoes, reshapes, and sometimes critiques another. And even if it is coincidence, even if the similarities come from shared human experience rather than direct influence. The story still speaks. It says communication is fragile. Unity can be dangerous when driven by ego, and the desire to build upward can make you forget the ground. You take one last breath of city air, warm brick and smoke and river, and you let the tower fade into the night sky. Not demolished, not proven, not disproven, just resting there as an image that keeps working on the mind. Quietly, like a slow turning gear, you find yourself on a shoreline that is not quite sea and not quite river, a broad, shallow edge where water and land negotiate every hour. The air is cool now, and the sky has the pale look of early dawn, that quiet blue-gray that makes your thoughts feel slower and heavier. The ground is scattered with shells and bits of reed, and the water laps with a steady patience, like it has all the time in the world to explain itself. This is where creation stories like to begin, in a place where boundaries are unclear. Water becomes sky, mud becomes ground, darkness becomes light. Most historians agree that many ancient cultures tell creation as an ordering process, not just a magical snap. You begin with chaos, then you separate, name, set limits, assign roles. Archaeology suggests that people who live with unstable rivers, shifting coasts, and seasonal extremes often imagine the world as something that must be maintained, not just made once. You take a slow step into the shallow water, and the silt swirls around your ankles like smoke. The sensation is calming in a strange way, as if your body understands the metaphor before your mind does. Everything starts mixed. Then it settles. Then it separates. Now you let two broad creation frameworks drift into view, not as competitors, but as two different ways of sculpting meaning. In Mesopotamian tradition, there are several creation stories and themes. One famous Babylonian text, often called Enuma Elish, describes a cosmic struggle among divine powers, culminating in the establishment of order and kingship among the gods. Another strand of Mesopotamian thought, including stories about humans being created for labor, emphasizes the practical purpose of humanity in maintaining divine order. These are not the only versions, and they vary by time and city. But the broad idea is mainstream. Creation is connected to cosmic administration. Genesis, in its opening chapter, describes creation in a structured sequence, with repeated patterns and a strong sense of order. Light and dark, sky and waters, land and vegetation, celestial bodies, animals, humans. The rhythm is almost liturgical. It reads like a deliberate arrangement. Most historians agree that the text is crafted, not accidental, and that its structure communicates meaning. The world is not born from a brawl, in this telling, but from a command that organizes. One interpretation is that Genesis is in conversation with older Near Eastern cosmologies, sometimes echoing familiar motifs while presenting a different theological emphasis. Another interpretation is that the similarities are the result of shared cultural grammar. Everyone in the region is speaking in mythic metaphors about water, sky, and order. A more cautious explanation could be that the natural world itself suggests these categories. Anyone can look up and see sky. Anyone can see land rising from water. Anyone can notice that light changes everything. You bend down and scoop a handful of wet sand. It slips between your fingers, and you imagine ancient people watching land emerge after a flood recedes. That is not cosmic creation, but it is a small, repeating reenactment of creation. The waters withdraw, and the ground appears. The plants return. The birds come back. In a river-based world, creation is not only a beginning, it is a cycle you witness again and again. That observation can shape myth. Now you focus on a specific motif that often comes up in comparisons: chaos waters. In Mesopotamian stories, primordial waters can be personified, sometimes as divine beings. In Enuma Elish, the watery chaos is tied to figures like Tiamat, and the ordering of the cosmos is linked to the defeat of chaotic forces. In Genesis, there is a phrase often translated as the deep, and the spirit or wind of God hovering over waters. The scene is watery and dark, but it is not framed as a battle in the same way. Instead, it is a poised moment before ordering speech. A careful reading might suggest that both traditions recognize water as a symbol of undifferentiated potential and danger, but they diverge in tone and theology. One uses conflict as a central engine, the other uses command and separation. Historians still argue whether the Genesis creation account is best read as a direct response to Mesopotamian creation myths, as an independent composition using common Near Eastern imagery, or as a blend of inherited motifs and distinctive religious claims. You let that line settle. It feels like standing on firm sand, not because it answers everything, but because it names the honest options. Now you step forward into the dawn light and notice the sky brightening. You think about the order of days in Genesis. Light appears before the sun and moon are set in the sky, which has prompted many interpretations. Some see it as poetic structure. Some see it as theological emphasis. Light is not dependent on a specific object. Some see it as a way of demoting celestial bodies, treating them as created lights rather than gods. That last angle is often discussed because in the ancient Near East, celestial bodies could be worshipped or mythologized as divine powers. One interpretation is that Genesis deliberately frames sun and moon as mere lights, not rulers with personalities. It names them in a way that avoids certain divine titles. That could be seen as a quiet argument, a way of saying the cosmos is not governed by competing deities, but by a single ordering power. Again, that is interpretation, but it fits the broader pattern of Genesis emphasizing unity and order. Now you look at Mesopotamian cosmology and see how gods and celestial phenomena intertwine. Planets and stars are watched for omens. The sky is read as a text. Priests and scholars develop elaborate systems to interpret signs. Archaeology suggests that this is not superstition in a simple sense, but an intellectual tradition with its own logic. The world is seen as meaningful, full of messages. You can disagree with the method and still respect the human need behind it, a desire to make the universe legible. You continue walking, and the shoreline becomes a flat plain. In the distance, you see a canal and fields beginning to green. Your mind shifts to humans in creation stories. In some Mesopotamian accounts, humans are created to take on labor that the gods do not want to do, maintaining temples and supporting divine order. It is a practical cosmology. Humans are workers in a cosmic economy. In Genesis, humans are given a role that can be read as stewardship, bearing the image of God, tasked with dominion in various interpretations. That role is debated, and modern readers argue about what it means ethically. Still, the difference in emphasis is notable. One tradition can feel like humans are made to serve the gods' needs. The other can feel like humans are made with a kind of dignity and responsibility. One interpretation is that Genesis elevates human status in a way that contrasts with some surrounding myths. Another interpretation is that both traditions still tie humans to duty, just expressed differently. A more cautious explanation could be that any agrarian society will imagine humans as responsible for maintaining order. Because in real life, if you stop maintaining, everything collapses into weeds and dust. Now the mystery angle enters. calm and labeled. A fringe idea proposes that ancient creation stories encode memory of real events, perhaps a dramatic environmental shift at the end of the last ice age, or a local catastrophe that felt like the world beginning again. This theory isn't widely accepted as a direct explanation for specific texts, because linking a myth line by line to a prehistoric event is difficult. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it adds a cinematic layer. What if the feeling of a world reordering, of shorelines changing and rivers moving, became the emotional fuel for creation language? A more cautious explanation could be simpler. Creation myths are philosophical poetry, not journalism. They tell you what a culture values. They tell you who is in charge, what order means, why the world is worth living in, and why it is frightening. They are maps of meaning. You stop and look at the horizon. The sun is rising now, and the world feels newly arranged. You notice something else. Genesis organizes creation into a weak pattern, a rhythm that leads to rest. That rhythm gives time a sacred shape. It makes order not just spatial but temporal. In many ancient cultures, time is marked by festivals, rituals, and cycles. But the specific framing of a 7-day structure in Genesis carries a distinct flavor. One interpretation is that it ties cosmic order to human life patterns, making daily practice part of creation itself. Now you shift back to Mesopotamia, where ritual calendars and temple cycles also structure life. People bring offerings, observe festivals, mark seasons. The divine order is maintained through repeated action. Again, different emphasis, similar human impulse. Take the overwhelming vastness of existence and make it manageable through rhythm. You walk along the canal, and you see the water split into smaller channels that feed fields. This is separation again. You realize separation is the core verb of many creation stories. Separate water from sky, separate sea from land, separate day from night. Separation creates boundaries, and the boundaries create stability. That is why creation stories feel linked even when they are not. They share a logic. In a world without boundaries, nothing can live. In a world with boundaries, life can flourish, but only if you respect the edges. Now you let your imagination do a gentle what if, clearly marked as imagination. What if, one night, a scribe sits near a canal and watches the moon reflect on the water. He has heard older myths that speak of chaos, waters, and divine conflict. He has also heard hymns that praise a single ordering power. He is not copying like a machine. He is composing like a human. He chooses a creation sequence that feels calm and structured, like breathing. He repeats phrases because repetition is soothing and authoritative. He shapes a story where the world is made in an ordered rhythm, as if creation itself is a lullaby, not to trick anyone, to comfort a community that has seen too much disorder. That is not a claim about a specific author. It is a cinematic way to feel how a text could arise from lived experience. You return to the shoreline again, where water meets land and keeps meeting it, over and over, endlessly. You realize that the question of link versus coincidence may be less important than the question of function. Both traditions are trying to do something similar. Explain why order exists, why it matters, and why humans have a role in it. And tonight, you let that be enough. You feel the sun warm your face, and you let your eyelids grow heavy. Creation stories are not just about beginnings. They are about permission. Permission to believe that the world is not random, even when it feels random. Permission to believe that light can arrive after darkness, even if it arrives slowly. Permission to believe that boundaries can hold, even if they sometimes break. You breathe in the cool air, and you watch the water glitter. The shore does not decide whether it is river or sea. It simply is. And that quiet acceptance makes your mind soften, as if the universe is gently separating your worries from you, placing them somewhere safe, like stones at the edge of the water. You climb a long stairway at night, each step worn smooth by countless feet, and the stone feels cool through the soles of your sandals. The air up here is thinner, drier, carrying the faint scent of incense and dusty brick. Somewhere below, the city hums with small sounds, dogs barking, a distant laugh, a pot clinking. But up on this high place the world feels quieter, like the sky has turned the volume down. At the top, you reach a terrace beside a tall temple structure, and you look out over rooftops and canals like you are peeking into a model of human life. Moonlight outlines the geometry. Water channels glint, and then your eyes lift to the stars, and you feel that familiar ancient sensation, small, curious, and just a little suspicious that the universe is watching back. This is the perfect place for the next set of stories, the ones that feel like they are standing on the edge between mainstream myth and the kind of mystery that makes people whisper. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Near Eastern literature includes larger-than-life figures, heroic kings, semi-divine ancestors, and beings that blur categories. Mesopotamian epics celebrate heroes who are strong enough to bend the world for a moment, then learn they cannot bend it forever. Genesis, too, includes strange glimpses of extraordinary figures, especially into passages that later readers find puzzling. One of the most famous is the brief and debated line about the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the mention of the Nephilim, often translated as giants or fallen ones, depending on interpretation. The text is short, which is almost rude, because it drops a mystery and walks away like it has somewhere else to be. You can almost hear the ancient writer saying, "Yes, yes, you will argue about this for centuries." Enjoy. Most historians agree that this passage has generated many interpretations in Jewish and Christian tradition. Scholars continue to debate what the original author and audience may have understood. Some interpretations see divine beings interacting with humans. Some see elite human rulers being described with divine language. Some see an ancient myth fragment preserved in a text that otherwise moves quickly past it. The evidence we do have is not enough to force a single conclusion. Now you bring in the Mesopotamian side, where heroes and semi-divine figures are more common and more detailed. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is described as partly divine, extraordinarily strong, and larger than ordinary life. He builds walls, fights monsters, and searches for immortality. Many Mesopotamian king lists and traditions also extend lifespans or give early rulers astonishing reign lengths. The pattern is familiar across ancient cultures. The farther back you go, the bigger the figures become, like memory-inflating ancestors into mythic scale. One interpretation is that Genesis is participating in a similar mythic language when it mentions extraordinary beings. Another interpretation is that Genesis is preserving a faint echo of a broader Near Eastern myth world, while keeping its own focus on human moral history. A more cautious explanation could be that stories about giants and semi-divine beings arise naturally in societies trying to explain impressive ruins, unusual bones, or the sheer psychological need to imagine a time when the world felt more enchanted. You stand near the edge of the terrace and look down. The city is quiet enough that you can hear wind brushing against woven mats. You think about why giants are so persistent in human storytelling. Giants make the world feel older and more dramatic. If you see a massive stone structure and cannot imagine how ordinary humans move the blocks, you might imagine larger humans. If you find a large fossil, you might imagine a monstrous creature that once walked like a person. Even if that is not scientifically accurate, it is emotionally logical. The mind fills gaps with big shapes. Now the mystery theory slips in, careful and labeled. A popular rumor claims that ancient stories of giants preserve memory of a real group of unusually tall people, or even a non-human lineage. This theory isn't widely accepted, and hard evidence for a separate giant species is lacking. Still, it survives because it offers a clean explanation for a messy feeling, the sense that the past is not fully accounted for. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a soft what if. What if some communities did include individuals who were notably taller or stronger, and their memory became mythic over generations? A more cautious explanation could be that giant language is symbolic, describing power, violence, or reputation rather than literal height. In many ancient texts, physical size can represent social dominance. When a tyrant feels enormous, the story may simply call him enormous. Now you turn your attention to another related cluster of ideas: watchers, heavenly beings, and forbidden knowledge. In later Jewish literature, especially texts like 1st Enoch, the watchers become a developed narrative, divine beings descending, teaching humans forbidden arts, and producing offspring. That tradition is influential in some later interpretations of Genesis 6. But 1 Enoch is not Genesis, and it is important not to confuse later elaboration with earlier text. Still, the existence of that elaboration tells you something about how magnetic the Genesis fragment is. It invites expansion like a spark invites tinder. Mesopotamian myth also contains themes of divine knowledge, hidden wisdom, and boundary crossing between realms. There are sages, sometimes called Apkallu in later tradition, associated with wisdom and civilization. They can be portrayed as semi-divine figures bringing knowledge. The parallels here are not direct and not perfect, but the thematic neighborhood is similar: beings from beyond teaching humans, and the consequences that follow. One interpretation is that the Genesis fragment is part of a wider ancient Near Eastern pattern of stories about boundary violations between divine and human realms. Another interpretation is that Genesis is deliberately brief to avoid endorsing the mythic complexity found elsewhere, keeping the focus on human responsibility. A more cautious explanation could be that the fragment is simply an old tradition preserved without full context, like a torn corner of a larger tapestry. Historians still argue whether the Nephilim passage is a remnant of older myth, a polemic against elite human rulers, or a compressed reference to ideas that were more fully known in its original cultural setting. You let that sentence sit in the night air, as calm as the stars. Now you explore a different angle that keeps the story fresh: hero kings and the psychology of power. In Mesopotamia, kingship is sacred in many ways. Kings are chosen by gods. They build temples. They wage wars. They claim to maintain order. Texts praise them extravagantly, sometimes exaggerating achievements, sometimes presenting a moral lesson, sometimes simply doing propaganda. This is mainstream history. Royal inscriptions are often self-flattering. Kings do not usually carve tablets that say, "Today I tried my best and still forgot where I put my sandals." Genesis and later biblical texts also wrestle with power, but often with a different tone. The mighty men language in Genesis 6 can be read as admiration, but it can also be read as critique. The passage sits near themes of violence and corruption leading toward catastrophe. One interpretation is that the mention of mighty men is not a compliment, but a warning. Fame and power can accelerate moral collapse. You shift your gaze from the city to the open plain beyond it. Darkness spreads there, and the wind feels freer. You imagine figures moving in that darkness, not literal monsters, but powerful people with influence and charisma. The ancient world, like the modern world, is full of people who are larger than life because everyone treats them that way. Fame inflates them, fear inflates them, poetry inflates them. Then, when the dust settles, they are still just human, but their stories have already escaped. Now you add a small, grounded detail. Ancient scribes sometimes used lists and genealogies to link present communities to legendary pasts. King lists in Mesopotamia extend reigns into impossible lengths, and genealogies in biblical tradition can also include long lifespans. This does not mean one copied the other directly, but it shows a shared cultural strategy. Use time and lineage to create authority. If your ancestor lived 900 years, your family tree becomes a monument. It is like saying, my lineage is not just old, it is cosmic, and here comes your sleepy joke, because you deserve one. If your ancestor lived 900 years, imagine the family reunion, imagine the speeches, imagine the same uncle telling the same story for 8 centuries. You would beg for the flood. Now, you step closer to the temple wall, where inscriptions might be carved. You think about how knowledge itself can feel like a forbidden power. In many traditions, certain knowledge belongs to priests, scribes, or the divine realm. When ordinary people gain it, it can feel destabilizing. That theme appears in Eden, in Watcher's traditions, in Mesopotamian wisdom lore, and in 1,000 modern movies where someone reads the wrong book at midnight. Humans are consistent. We love knowledge, and we fear it. A fringe idea proposes that forbidden knowledge stories preserve memories of advanced ancient technologies lost to time. This is not widely accepted, and there is little reliable evidence that ancient myths are literal technical manuals. Still, if you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle cinematic image. What if a few rare techniques, like metallurgy, astronomy, or medicine, felt so powerful to early societies that they could only be explained as gifts from beyond? A more cautious explanation could be that these stories are moral frameworks. They teach that knowledge requires wisdom, and wisdom requires restraint. They warn against the kind of learning that outpaces character. Now you let the night deepen. The stars look like tiny punctures in a dark cloth. You realize that the fascination with giants and watchers is partly a fascination with boundaries. Where does human end and divine begin? Where does natural end and supernatural begin? Where does history end and myth begin? Tonight, you keep those boundaries visible. Some parts are documented. Ancient texts exist that mention heroes, semi-divine figures, and mysterious beings. Some parts are interpretation. Scholars propose readings that connect motifs across cultures. And some parts are gentle imagination, like picturing watchers on a temple roof, leaning over the edge, curious about human life the way you are curious about them. Here is that gentle imagination, clearly labeled. What if, on a night like this, you are a young scribe assigned to copy an old fragment about mighty ones from long ago? You do not fully understand it, but you can feel its weight. You copy the signs carefully, trying not to smudge. Outside, the city sleeps. Inside, the lamp flickers. You wonder if the fragment is warning you about power, or teasing you with a mystery, or both. You do not solve it. You preserve it. You pass the puzzle forward. That is the cinematic what if. No certainty. No hidden truth. Just the human act of carrying a question into the future. You step back from the terrace edge and let the wind cool your face. The city below feels small again. The giants shrink into metaphor. The watchers become an open question. And you, standing under the sky, realize the most honest way to hold this material is not to insist, but to wonder gently. You stand in a quiet courtyard where the stones are warm from the day and cooling fast, releasing heat like a slow sigh. A small lamp burns on a low table, and its flame leans with the breeze, obedient and slightly dramatic. Nearby, a bowl of water reflects the light in soft ripples. This is not a battlefield or a tower or a floodplain. This is a place where people sit down and try to make life make sense with rules. Most historians agree that law and administration are central to Mesopotamian city life. Archaeology suggests that written law codes and legal records appear early and become widespread, covering contracts, property disputes, marriage arrangements, debt, adoption, labor obligations, and penalties. It is not a world without morality. It is a world that tries to translate morality into enforceable practices, which is basically humanity's favorite hobby. Right after arguing, you take a seat beside the lamp and imagine a scribe unrolling his toolkit, reed stylus, clay, a small smoothing board. He is not writing poetry here. He is writing the structure of society. And that is its own kind of power. A law is a story about what a community values, written in the language of consequences. Now you let two big frameworks come into view: Mesopotamian law codes and biblical covenant traditions. In Mesopotamia, one of the most famous law collections is the Code of Hammurabi, carved on a stele with a prologue and epilogue that frame the laws as royal justice under divine authority. There are other law collections too, earlier and later, and the broader legal culture includes thousands of everyday documents. What's broadly accepted is that these texts show a society deeply invested in regulating relationships and stabilizing commerce. In Genesis and the broader biblical tradition, law and covenant become central themes, though Genesis itself is more story-driven than law-driven. Covenant language appears as promises, obligations, and identity markers. Later, biblical books develop explicit legal collections, but the covenant concept is already present as a pattern, a relationship defined by commitments, blessings, warnings, and signs. One interpretation is that covenant language echoes the structure of ancient treaties and political agreements common in the Near East, where a great king binds a smaller partner with stipulations and promised benefits. Another interpretation is that biblical covenant is distinct in its theological framing and communal identity function. A more cautious explanation could be that any complex society develops formalized commitments, and religious language naturally merges with political language because power and belief are intertwined. You look down at the courtyard stones and imagine them as tablets, each one holding an unspoken rule. Do not steal. Do not lie. Pay your debts. Protect the vulnerable. Honor agreements. These values appear in many societies because they are the glue that keeps humans from eating each other alive socially, which is honestly the bare minimum goal. Now, you focus on an important mainstream detail. Mesopotamian law codes often reflect a stratified society, with different penalties depending on status: free person, dependent, enslaved. This does not mean people lacked empathy, but it shows how hierarchy is embedded into justice. In biblical law, hierarchy exists too, but there is also an emphasis in many passages on protecting widows, orphans, and strangers, at least as an ideal. Interpreters debate how effectively those ideals were practiced. Still, The presence of such moral language is significant in the way it frames community identity. Now you shift to the mechanism of law itself. Writing. Archaeology suggests that writing makes law portable and consistent. At least in theory, a written code can be displayed, referenced, taught, but everyday legal practice is still messy. People argue, witnesses contradict, judges get tired. Someone forgets to bring the right seal. Someone tries to cheat, and you can almost hear the ancient equivalent of, "Your Honor, my client's donkey was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time." You smile. Because yes, even ancient justice probably had its share of ridiculous cases. Now you step deeper into the covenant idea. In Genesis, covenants appear in narratives involving figures like Noah, Abraham, and others, with signs such as a rainbow or circumcision, depending on the passage. These covenants define relationships and future expectations. In Mesopotamia, treaties and oaths also define relationships, often sealed by rituals, shared meals, and the invocation of gods as witnesses. The structure can look similar: preamble, stipulations, blessings, curses, witnesses, memorial sign. You see the same social technology in different religious clothing. One interpretation is that biblical writers use familiar treaty forms to communicate divine commitments in a way people would understand. Another interpretation is that the resemblance is general because treaty logic is a common human strategy. A more cautious explanation could be that when you want to make an agreement feel unbreakable, you wrap it in ceremony and call the sky as witness. Humans have always liked dramatic paperwork. Now comes the required debate cue. Gently placed. Historians still argue whether biblical covenant forms are directly modeled on specific Near Eastern treaty traditions, or whether the similarities reflect shared legal and political culture without direct copying. You let that sit, like a seal pressed into clay, leaving an impression without needing to shout. Now the story takes a new development. The idea of justice as divine image. In Mesopotamian royal ideology, kings often present themselves as chosen by gods to establish justice, protect the weak, and maintain order. This is partly ideal and partly propaganda, but it is a real theme. In Genesis, the concept of humans made in the image of God can be interpreted as democratizing dignity, extending a kind of royal language to humanity as a whole. In many ancient cultures, being in a god's image is linked to kingship. So the idea that all humans bear that image can be read as a profound statement. One interpretation is that Genesis subtly reconfigures royal ideology by giving divine likeness to humans broadly, not just to kings. Another interpretation is that the image language has other meanings, like representing God's authority on earth through stewardship. Either way, it shows that Genesis is not only telling stories, it is doing political theology, shaping how people understand authority, identity, and responsibility. Now, you turn to another law-connected topic that keeps listeners awake in the best way: curses and blessings. Ancient treaties often include lists of blessings for obedience and curses for rebellion. These are not just threats, they are worldview statements. They claim that the universe has moral wiring, that actions produce consequences beyond immediate human enforcement. In biblical tradition, blessings and curses are also woven into covenant thinking. The community's fate is linked to its moral choices. This can be comforting or terrifying, depending on your week. You look at the lamp flame again and think about how humans handle uncertainty. When drought hits or war comes, people look for meaning. A covenant framework offers meaning. We are in relationship with the divine, and our choices matter. Mesopotamian religion also offers meaning through ritual, omens, and divine favor. The systems differ, but the need is shared. Now, The mystery theory enters softly, and you label it as mist. A fringe idea proposes that ancient law codes and covenant texts hide an older, lost universal legal system, as if all civilizations inherited a single primordial constitution. This is not widely accepted, and evidence for a single origin document is thin. Still, the idea persists because it feels tidy and grand. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic image, a forgotten set of principles traveling like a shadow under many cultures, resurfacing in different words. A more cautious explanation could be that humans converge on similar rules because similar social problems require similar solutions. Theft, violence, fraud, and betrayal are not unique to any one culture. They are part of the human package, like sleepiness and the urge to snack at midnight. Now you shift to the very practical thing that makes laws work: seals. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals are used to mark identity and authorize transactions. A person rolls a carved seal over wet clay, leaving a unique image: animals, gods, symbols, scenes. It is a signature and a security device. Archaeology suggests seals are widespread and culturally important, and their imagery tells us about beliefs and status. You imagine the satisfying moment of rolling a seal on clay, that tiny crunch, that smooth glide, the pattern appearing like magic. This is the ancient version of clicking "I agree," except more artistic and probably less regrettable. In biblical narratives, covenants are often marked by signs, rituals, or memorial objects. The form differs, but the function can be similar. Make the invisible agreement visible. Humans are not great at trusting pure abstraction. We like objects we can touch. One interpretation is that covenant signs operate as embodied reminders, grounding belief in practice. Another interpretation is that they also serve as identity markers in communities under pressure, helping people remember who they are when politics tries to rename them. Now you let your imagination offer a gentle what-if. Clearly marked as imagination, what if you are a judge or elder sitting in a city gate where disputes are heard? Two neighbors argue about a boundary stone moved in the night. A scribe records their claims. Witnesses speak. A seal is rolled onto clay, making the agreement official. Later, a storyteller tells the tale not as boring legal procedure, but as a moral lesson. Boundaries matter, truth matters, community matters, and somewhere else. Another community shapes similar procedures into covenant language, not because one copied the other line by line, but because the human need for trust and structure pushes stories towards similar shapes. That is a mood. It helps you see how law and story intertwine. You stand up from the courtyard and stretch, feeling the pull in your shoulders. You realize that law is not the opposite of myth. Law is myth's practical cousin. Myth says the universe is ordered. Law says, fine. Then here is how we live inside that order. Myth gives meaning. Law gives boundaries. Both are attempts to keep chaos from taking over. And in the end, the link question becomes less about plagiarism and more about cultural conversation. Mesopotamia and Israelite tradition share a region where treaties, oaths, seals, and justice language are part of daily life. Similar forms can appear because similar social tools are in the air. Distinct meanings can still be expressed through those forms. You watch the lamp flame lean again in the breeze, and you feel your mind settling. Rules are not only constraints. They are the quiet walls that let a community sleep, at least when the rules are fair, and even when the rules are not fair. The act of writing them down reveals what a society believes about itself. You exhale slowly, and the courtyard becomes still. The stones cool. The water in the bowl stops rippling, and you let the idea of covenant and law rest in your mind like a folded cloth. Neat, ordered, ready to be opened again another night. You sit at a low desk in a quiet room where the only sound is the soft scratch of a stylus and the occasional pop of a lamp wick. The air smells like warm clay and faint smoke. A basket of tablets rests nearby, stacked like flat loaves of bread. You feel the strange comfort of a place built for counting, where every mark has a purpose and every purpose can be marked. Tonight, your focus is numbers, names, and the kind of time that feels too large to fit inside a human skull. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian scribes loved lists. Lists of kings, lists of professions, lists of stars, lists of plants, lists of gods with their epithets, lists of words in multiple languages. Archaeology suggests that scribal education often involved copying lexical lists and numerical exercises. A scribe is trained not only to write, but to measure reality. And when you measure reality long enough, you start to measure the past, too. Now you let the king list tradition enter the room, a famous Mesopotamian genre that records rulers and their reign lengths, often beginning with legendary antediluvian kings whose reigns last thousands of years. The numbers are enormous, and scholars debate how to interpret them. Some see symbolic numerology. Some see ideological statements about ancient greatness. Some see a mixture of myth and history intentionally blended. The evidence we do have points to the list being edited over time, shaped by political needs and cultural memory. Genesis contains its own long genealogies, and in them you meet the striking ages of early figures, lifespans far beyond modern experience. Most historians agree that these numbers are not straightforward biography in the modern sense. They function as literature, tradition, and meaning. The text is telling you something about the weight of early time, the closeness of origins, and perhaps the gradual narrowing of human life. One interpretation is that long lifespans are symbolic, marking a world nearer to creation, nearer to divine blessing, or nearer to a mythic golden age. Another interpretation is that the numbers preserve older chronological traditions adapted into a new framework. A more cautious explanation could be that early time is narrated as larger than life, because humans experience the distant past as larger than life. Your mind inflates the beginning because beginnings feel sacred. You pick up a stylus and press a wedge into clay, then another, and you realize something. Numbers are not neutral. In ancient cultures, numbers can carry symbolic value. Mesopotamia uses a sexagesimal system based on 60, which influences timekeeping and measurement. Certain numbers can be associated with cosmic order, with completeness, with divine patterns. In biblical tradition, numbers also carry symbolic resonance in many interpretations. Not always, not in every case, but often enough to be worth considering. Now you take a close look at the ages in Genesis and the reign lengths in Mesopotamian lists, not to force them to match, but to notice how they function. They create a bridge between mythic time and historical time. They place human figures into a timeline that feels anchored. Even if the numbers themselves are debated, they give you a sense of sequence. They say, this came before that. They create the feeling of memory being organized, like placing bones into a skeleton. One interpretation is that genealogies and king lists are social technology. They establish legitimacy. They connect the present to a meaningful past. They tell a community who they are by telling them where they came from. A more cautious explanation could be that humans, faced with time's vastness, need a rope to hold on to, and lists are that rope. Historians still argue whether the long ages in Genesis reflect influence from Mesopotamian chronological traditions. independent symbolic storytelling, or a combination of inherited motifs and local theological meaning. You let that sentence settle. Then you turn to names. Names are often treated as clues. In Genesis, names can carry meanings, word plays, or character hints, depending on interpretation. In Mesopotamian literature, names of kings, gods, and heroes can also be packed with meaning, epithets, and symbolic associations. But the tricky part is that languages differ, and wordplay often does not translate cleanly across cultures. A name that sounds meaningful in Sumerian will not necessarily sound meaningful in Hebrew. So when people claim a direct connection based on a name alone, caution is wise. Still, there are broader naming patterns that are worth noticing. Both traditions use genealogies and lists as narrative scaffolding. Both traditions preserve names that may come from older layers of traditions. Both traditions place those names in ordered sequences. That can raise the possibility of shared cultural habits rather than direct copying. Now you shift to another fresh development. The idea of decreasing lifespans. In Genesis, the ages of early figures are long, and later ages tend to shorten over time. Interpreters debate why. Some read it as a moral or spiritual decline. Some read it as a narrative device to move from mythic time toward recognizable human time. Some read it as a way of explaining why people no longer live like legendary ancestors. In Mesopotamian king lists, the antediluvian reigns are enormous, and later reigns become more realistic. That pattern is similar in function, even if the details differ. It is a way of moving from the legendary to the historical. The earlier world is bigger, then it narrows into something you can count without laughing. One interpretation is that both traditions are expressing the same intuition. The beginning of the world feels vast, and the present feels smaller. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how myth and history blend in human memory. Now the mystery theory enters. Soft and careful. A popular rumor claims that the extreme ages are literal, and that ancient humans were physically different, perhaps living in a radically different environment, or even having a different genetic makeup. This idea is not widely accepted in mainstream scholarship, and there is no solid scientific evidence that humans routinely lived for many centuries in the historical periods associated with these texts. Still, if you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can become a cinematic question. What if time felt longer in the early imagination because life itself felt closer to the sacred? A more cautious explanation could be that numbers are doing literary work. They are giving weight, not reporting birthdays. Now you focus on counting systems, because this is a detail many people ignore. Mesopotamia's base 60 system influences how they organize time and measure space. 60 divides nicely into many factors, making it practical for fractions and trade. That practicality can become sacred over time. A number system becomes a worldview. When you measure land, you measure labor. When you measure labor, you measure value. When you measure value, you build hierarchy. Numbers can be power. In biblical tradition, counting also matters. Though the system differs, census counts, genealogies, ritual calendars, and symbolic numbers appear. Some readers see deliberate numerical patterns in genealogies, suggesting that they may be shaped for meaning. Scholars debate how much is intentional structure versus later pattern seeking by readers. The evidence we do have allows for both cautious pattern recognition and caution against overconfidence. Historians still argue whether perceived numerical patterns in Genesis genealogies reflect intentional design, inherited traditional frameworks, or later interpretive overlays. Now you let your mind rest on the phrase later interpretive overlays, because it is a gentle reminder. Readers love patterns. Sometimes the pattern is there, Sometimes your brain is just doing what brains do, connecting dots because it hates loose ends. You glance at a tablet stack and imagine scribes copying genealogies. The act of copying itself can influence numbers. A sign can be misread. A mark can be smudged. A scribe can make an error, and another scribe can faithfully reproduce the error for generations. This is not an insult to scribes. It is a realistic view of hand copying. You have probably typed your own name wrong at least once, and you have the advantage of autocorrect, which, to be fair, is also a menace. Now for a gentle what if, clearly labeled as imagination. What if you are a student scribe tasked with copying a list of ancient kings? You do not fully grasp the meaning of the huge numbers, but you sense they are important. They make the past feel grand. You copy them carefully. Across the region, another student copies a genealogy where ancestors live for centuries, and he feels the same awe. Neither of you is trying to deceive. You are participating in a cultural way of honoring origins. The numbers are like tall columns in a temple, making the foundation look deeper than it is. Not in a dishonest way, but in a reverent way. That is imagination. It helps you feel the human motive behind the math. Now you return to the steady lamplight and place one more grounded thought on the desk. Even if there is some connection between Mesopotamian list traditions and Genesis genealogies, a connection does not erase distinct meaning. A list can be used to glorify kings, or to anchor a community's identity, or to frame a theological message about time and mortality. Similar tools can build different houses. You set the stylus down and listen to the quiet. Numbers, in the end, are another kind of story. They tell you what a culture thinks matters enough to count. They tell you what a culture wants to remember. And they tell you how a culture imagines distance between then and now. You look at your hands, lightly dusted with clay, and you feel how calming it is to reduce the chaos of life into marks on a surface. Maybe that is why these lists endure. Not because they solve everything, but because they make time feel touchable. The lamp flickers. The room stays warm. The tablets sit in patient stacks, and your mind, steadying, begins to count its own breaths. 1, 2, 3. As if you are writing your own quiet list of moments, each one passing gently into the next. You walk down a narrow street at night where the buildings lean close, as if they are gossiping over your head. The stones underfoot are uneven, polished by years of sandals and rain. Somewhere a door creaks open, then closes softly, and you smell bread cooling on a ledge. The air carries a hint of smoke and ink. That particular smell that clings to places where people stay up late to write what they cannot afford to forget. This street leads you toward a workshop that is part office, part classroom, part sanctuary. Inside, a lamp glows. The light is low, but it is enough for a scribe to see the lines he is copying. This is where stories travel, not on wings, not on secret ships, but on hands. Hands that write, hands that erase, hands that choose which words survive. What's broadly accepted is that texts in the ancient Near East are shaped by scribal culture. Archaeology suggests that schools existed where students learned to write by copying established compositions, and that libraries of tablets could collect religious, literary, and administrative works. In this world, a story can become stable if it is taught. It can spread if it is copied. It can change if it is edited. It can disappear if it is not valued by a community at a particular moment. You step into the workshop and see a table scattered with clay tablets and perhaps, in other contexts, scrolls or writing surfaces. You see a water bowl for smoothing clay. You see reeds and styluses. You see a small pile of broken pieces. Because not every draft is a masterpiece and not every student is a genius. The ancient world has its own version of crumpled paper in the trash. Now you let the travel question take center stage. How do motifs move from one tradition to another, if they do at all? There are several mainstream pathways. Trade and diplomacy can move stories. When merchants travel, they carry tales as entertainment and as social glue. When diplomats negotiate, they share narratives about gods, kings, and origins, because culture is power. War and conquest can move stories too, in harsher ways. Captives bring their memories into new places. Soldiers brag. Survivors mourn. Those emotions become narrative fuel. And then there is the pathway that matters a lot for biblical tradition: displacement and empire. Most historians agree that imperial domination and periods of exile or displacement affect the literature of smaller communities. When a community is pressured, it often writes more, edits more, and organizes its traditions more deliberately. Writing becomes a way to preserve identity when politics tries to erase it. That does not mean every text is written in exile, but it does mean that historical stress can intensify literary activity and reflection. One interpretation is that some biblical texts, including portions of the Pentateuch, take shape through long processes that include moments of crisis, when older traditions are gathered, edited, and reframed. Another interpretation is that the influence of empire is present, but not always decisive in each passage. A more cautious explanation could be that communities always shape their stories, but crisis makes the shaping more visible. You watch a scribe dip a tool, press marks, pause, and then pause again, like he is listening for the right rhythm. He is not a photocopier, he is a human editor. He may copy faithfully, but he also lives inside a worldview. He knows what his community believes. He knows what his elders teach. He knows what the empire demands, even if he never writes a political slogan. Politics is still in the air like dust. Now, you shift to another new development: translation as transformation. Cuneiform texts move across languages. A Sumerian composition can be copied and studied long after Sumerian is no longer a spoken language, treated as a learned tongue in scribal education. Akkadian scribes can preserve Sumerian literature, and in doing so, they may add glosses, explanations, and variations. This is mainstream in the sense that multilingual scribal culture is real and documented. When a story moves through translation, it changes, not necessarily in meaning, but in texture. A wordplay disappears, a metaphor shifts, a god's epithet gains a new nuance, a character's name gets pronounced differently. And if the story moves into a new cultural context, the audience hears it differently. A flood story told by one community may feel like moral warning, while another hears it as a cosmic reset, while another hears it as grief. So if Genesis motifs share similarities with Mesopotamian motifs, one explanation is not direct copying, but long-term diffusion through translated, adapted, and retold traditions. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it is plausible in a connected region. Historians still argue whether the strongest points of contact between biblical narratives and Mesopotamian traditions come from direct literary borrowing, indirect diffusion through shared cultural networks, or independent reuse of common mythic building blocks. You let that line settle like ink drying. Now, you notice another mechanism: rebuttal. Sometimes a text seems to echo a known motif in order to disagree with it. This is not a weird conspiracy. It is a normal human practice. You repeat someone's claim, then you answer it. You take a familiar story shape, then you reshape it to make your own point. One interpretation is that some biblical passages can be read as offering an alternative theology within a landscape of competing religious ideas. A more cautious explanation could be that writers use familiar imagery because it is what people understand, even when they intend a different message. In that sense, similarity can be a sign of difference. A story can sound familiar precisely because it is trying to persuade you to see familiar things in a new way. You step closer to the table and see a tablet that has been copied multiple times. You notice small differences. A line added, a line shortened, a sign replaced. Variation is not always corruption. Variation can be a living tradition. In oral storytelling, variation is expected. In scribal copying, variation happens anyway. Sometimes it is accidental. Sometimes it is intentional. Sometimes it is a correction. Sometimes it is an update. Now, the mystery angle arrives. Soft and safe, a fringe idea proposes that certain ancient stories were guarded by elite scribal circles and shared only in secret, like a hidden curriculum. This theory isn't widely accepted as a general explanation, because we do have evidence of scribal schooling and public inscriptions that suggest a mix of open and specialized knowledge. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a cinematic image, a dim room where a master scribe teaches a small group a story that outsiders only hear in fragments. A more cautious explanation could be that literacy itself is the filter. If only a small portion of people can read and write, then texts are naturally controlled by those who can. That is not secret society drama. That is basic social structure. You walk toward a window and look out at the street. A child runs past chasing a dog. Two neighbors argue about water rights. A woman carries a jar. None of them are reading epics. Yet they live inside the same culture the scribes are recording. So stories move not only through tablets, but through life. A ritual here, a festival there, a proverb repeated at dinner, a lullaby, a curse muttered under breath. Text is one channel. Speech is another. Experience is the biggest channel of all. Now you take a moment to consider contact zones, places where cultures meet intensely. Cities under empire become contact zones. Temples become contact zones. Markets become contact zones. Military camps become contact zones. Even marriages become contact zones. Because families blend customs. In such places, stories can cross without anyone noticing the exact moment of crossing. A person can grow up hearing motifs from multiple traditions and never separate them cleanly. That is why the link question can be so slippery. When a region shares symbols and experiences for centuries, you can get convergence without a single moment of borrowings you can point to with a finger. Now, you imagine a different scene, calm and cinematic, clearly labeled as imagination. What if you are a young Judean scribe living under imperial shadow, hearing stories in the marketplace that sound familiar but not identical to your community's traditions? You hear a flood story told in another tongue. You hear a temple hymn to a powerful god of a great city. You hear a boast about a king who builds walls that touch the sky. You go home and copy your own traditions, not to imitate the empire, but to preserve your people's memory. Yet the language of the empire is in the air. The imagery is everywhere, and it seeps in like smoke. You write carefully, and in doing so, you create a text that is both rooted in your community and aware of the wider world. That is imagination, not a claim about a specific individual, but it helps you feel the process without needing certainty. Now you return to the workshop and notice the fatigue in the scribe's shoulders. Copying is labor. Editing is labor. Preserving tradition is not romantic in the moment. It is repetitive. It is meticulous. It is often thankless. The scribe's reward is not applause. It is continuity. You realize that whether Genesis and Mesopotamian stories are linked in direct ways or merely share a cultural atmosphere, Scribes are the carriers. They are the quiet engine of survival. Without them, most of these debates would not even exist. Without them, you would not have the puzzle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can see similarities. We can map contexts. We can propose pathways. But the exact moment a motif shifts hands is often invisible, like a seed carried by wind. You step back out into the street. The lamplight fades behind you. The city hushes, and you feel the calm truth of it. Stories travel the way people travel, messy, indirect, shaped by need, shaped by memory, shaped by the simple fact that humans cannot stop telling each other what the world means. You settle into a quiet room where the walls are thick and the outside world feels far away. A single lamp burns with a steady, sleepy flame. On the floor, a small bowl of water catches the light. On a shelf, a few tablets and scrolls rest like calm, patient animals. The air is still, and the silence has that soft, padded quality that makes your thoughts slow down without being told. Now the question returns in its simplest form, the one you can hold without squeezing it too hard. Are the Sumerian and Mesopotamian stories linked to Genesis? Or is it coincidence? What's broadly accepted is that the ancient Near East is a connected cultural region across long spans of time, and that Mesopotamian literature is older than the final forms of many biblical texts. It is also broadly accepted that Genesis shares some motifs with older Near Eastern traditions: flood, gardens, cosmic order, genealogies, and the drama of human pride. Those parallels are real enough to notice, and they deserve careful attention. But the moment you try to turn that attention into certainty, the ground turns slippery. Because similarity has more than one cause. There is direct dependence, where a writer knows a text and uses it. There is indirect diffusion, where a motif circulates in the wider cultural atmosphere through many channels and arrives without a single traceable handoff. There is also convergence, where cultures faced with similar realities create similar story shapes without borrowing. And in the ancient world, all three can happen, sometimes at once. One interpretation is that Genesis participates in a long conversation with the mythic and cultural world around it, sometimes echoing familiar patterns and sometimes reorienting them toward a distinct theological message. Another interpretation is that the similarities are overstated by modern readers hungry for neat connections, and that Genesis should be read primarily within its own literary and religious development. A more cautious explanation could be that Genesis is both, deeply rooted in its own tradition while also breathing the same regional air as neighboring cultures. Historians still argue whether the best way to describe the relationship is borrowing, adaptation, shared symbolism, or independent development with occasional points of contact. You let that debate line land gently, not as a frustration, but as a pillow. Uncertainty can be restful when it is honest. Now, you take a fresh angle for this final section, so it feels like a new development rather than repetition, the idea of purpose. Instead of asking who copied whom, you ask what each story is trying to do. In many Mesopotamian myths, the divine world is crowded. There are councils, rivalries, negotiations, and cosmic politics. Humans often exist within that divine economy, sometimes as workers, sometimes as worshippers, sometimes as pawns, sometimes as favorites. The stories can be frank about chaos, and they can be fascinated with the tension between fate and effort. Genesis, while it shares some images and story shapes that feel familiar in the region, often emphasizes a different purpose. Its narratives frequently direct attention toward moral choices, covenant identity, and a unified divine voice. That does not make it superior or inferior. It makes it different in emphasis. One interpretation is that Genesis takes common ancient questions and answers them in a distinctive tone, more focused on ethics and relationship than on divine politics. If that interpretation is right, then similarity becomes a tool rather than a problem. Familiar motifs are the shared language of the region. Genesis speaks that language, then says something particular with it. Now you consider the listener, you sitting in the quiet room. Why does this question matter to you at all? Because it touches something personal. You want to know whether the stories you grew up with are unique. You want to know whether they are part of a wider human tapestry. You want to know whether faith and history can share a room without fighting. You want a clean answer. And the ancient world refuses to give you one, because the ancient world is complicated and human. So here is a calm way to hold it. Using the truth ladder we promised. Documented ground. Mesopotamian texts exist that include motifs comparable to some found in Genesis, and they are older in their earliest written forms. There is also solid evidence that the cultures of the region interacted over long periods through trade, war, and empire. Interpretation ground. It is reasonable to suggest that shared cultural contexts can lead to shared motifs, and it is also reasonable to suggest that later writers may adapt familiar themes to communicate a new theological point. Scholars propose these possibilities in various ways, and no single path is universally agreed. Imagined ground. What if these stories are like rivers that meet in a delta, mixing water without losing their distinct currents? What if the shared motifs are not proof of copying, but proof of common human questions, carried on the same winds, under the same stars? Now the mystery angle arrives one last time, gentle and clearly labeled. A popular rumor claims that all ancient origin stories descend from one hidden source, a primeval archive that was lost in some catastrophe, leaving only fragments in different traditions. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a single original text is thin. Still, it persists because it offers a satisfying narrative, a single route for many branches. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime thought. What if humans are all reaching for the same deep memory, even if that memory is not literal, but emotional? The memory of being small in a huge world. A more cautious explanation could be that humans independently invent similar motifs because we share similar brains, similar fears, and similar hopes. Flood is an obvious fear in riverlands. Garden is an obvious symbol for ordered life. Tower is an obvious symbol for ambition. Long ages are an obvious way to make origins feel grand. You do not need secret archives to get there. You only need the human imagination doing its ancient work. Now you look at the bowl of water again. It reflects the lamp, and the reflection trembles when you breathe. Like your breath is a soft weather system, that image becomes your final lens. These stories are reflections, not perfect mirrors, but reflections of cultures trying to understand their place. If Genesis shares reflections with Mesopotamian stories, it might be because of contact. It might be because of shared environment. It might be because of shared human nature. The honest answer is that you can hold all three with open hands. And here is the most sleep-friendly conclusion, the one that does not demand you choose a side. You can accept that Genesis likely emerges within a world of older Near Eastern storytelling, and that it may echo some motifs that were already circulating. You can also accept that Genesis is not merely a copy, because it arranges its motifs with distinctive priorities and meanings. Similarity does not erase uniqueness. Uniqueness does not require isolation. You let your shoulders drop. You allow your jaw to unclench. You do not need to win an argument tonight. You do not need to prove anything tonight. You can simply enjoy the puzzle as a puzzle. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and in that separation, your mind gets permission to rest. Now the wind down begins, slow and soft. You imagine the ancient world dimming like a lamp being turned down. The city noises soften. The canals stop glinting. The temple stairs cool under moonlight. The clay tablets sit quietly, their wedge marks no longer demanding analysis, only offering presence. You are not in a debate hall. You are in a calm room where stories are allowed to be old, layered, and incomplete. You listen to your own breathing and notice that it has a rhythm, like a simple chant. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The rhythm is older than writing, older than cities, older than any myth. And that is comforting, because it means you belong to something that does not need to be proven. If your mind tries to jump back into comparison, you let it drift, the way you let a leaf drift on water. You do not chase it, you watch it float. You let it pass. The question of links and coincidence becomes smaller, not because it is unimportant, but because you are bigger than a single answer. The lamp flame stays steady. The bowl of water stays still. The room stays safe. And as you close your eyes, you let the oldest truth settle over you like a light blanket. Humans tell stories to survive, to remember, to explain, to comfort. Whether the motifs are shared or separate, the impulse is the same. You are part of that impulse. And tonight it asks nothing from you except rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.